This is Chill to Know.
Welcome to Chill to Know.
Hey, everyone.
Today, we're diving deep into something that's got everyone talking.
Yeah, it's been all over the news.
Tariffs.
Specifically, what the U.S. is doing and how China's reacting.
We've got a ton of sources.
News articles, expert opinions, the whole works.
And we want to break it all down.
Yeah, figure out what it means for the U.S. and China for, the global economy, really.
Cut through the noise and get to what matters.
Exactly.
So we've got info on these reciprocal tariffs the U.S. is using.
And don't forget the universal tariff, too.
Right, plus how China's pushing back.
They're not taking this lying down.
Not at all. We'll also look at what the experts are saying about the economic fallout.
And touch on the bigger picture, the implications for global trade.
So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So first up, let's unpack what the U.S. did and why.
Okay, so back on April 2nd.
That's not that long ago.
No, very recent. President Trump declares a national emergency.
A national emergency, that's serious.
It is. And the reason given. Unfair foreign trade practices.
So that's the basis for all this.
Yeah, that's what the White House is saying. This then led to these responsive tariffs they're talking about.
Responsive tariffs? What are those exactly?
Well, the idea is to boost the U.S. economy, make it stronger, and also protect American jobs.
Safeguarding American jobs, that's a big talking point.
It always is, especially in trade policy.
It makes sense. People want to know their jobs are secure.
Absolutely.
So the White House keeps mentioning this golden rule of trade.
Ah, yes. The idea that how the U.S. treats other countries in trade, they should treat the U.S. the same way.
It's about reciprocity. You scratch my back, I scratch yours.
Exactly, that concept of give and take.
So it's not just talk, right?
No, they put actions behind these words.
Like on April 5th, they slapped a 10% tariff on all imports.
A universal tariff hitting everything coming in.
Then, boom, just a few days later on April 9th, they roll out these reciprocal tariffs.
Now those are targeted. Over 60 trading partners are in the crosshairs.
And here's the kicker. These reciprocal tariffs are on top of that initial 10%.
So you've got a double whammy, a base tariff for everyone, and then extra tariffs depending on the country.
It's like a two-tier system.
Exactly. So how do they calculate these reciprocal tariffs? What's the formula?
Well, it seems to be based on the trade deficit.
The trade deficit, that's the difference between what the U.S. buys from a country versus what it sells to them.
Right. So they take that deficit, divide it by the total value of imports from that country, then cut the result in half.
Okay, so for China, this led to a 34% reciprocal tariff.
That's huge. So basically, if the U.S. buys way more from a country than it sells to them, and it's importing a lot overall,
Then the U.S. sees that as an unbalanced relationship, and that leads to a higher reciprocal tariff.
it's a way to measure how uneven they think the trade is.
Exactly. And speaking of China, the U.S. assigned them a 67% trade barrier value,
67%, that's massive. How did they come up with that?
based on a $295 billion goods deficit.
Wow, that's a big gap.
And it's not just the recent tariffs either. The U.S. has been gradually increasing tariffs on Chinese goods for a while.
It's like a slow buildup of pressure.
Yeah, so going back a bit, February 4th, the U.S. imposed a 10% tariff on all imports from China.
A flat 10% on everything.
Then, a month later, on March 4th, they bumped it up to 20%.
So 10%, then 20%, and those were on top of existing tariffs.
You got it. The previous administration had tariffs averaging around 20%.
Okay, so multiple layers of tariffs already in place.
Exactly.
And then this April 9th reciprocal tariff comes along.
Another 34% on top of everything else.
So for Chinese imports, we have existing tariffs, then a 10% hike, another 10%, and now this 34%.
It all adds up. What's the total impact? What does it actually cost to bring stuff in from China now?
Brace yourself. The minimum tariff on Chinese imports is now 104%.
Wow, over 100%.
That's not just a nudge, it's a wall.
It's definitely designed to change how businesses operate.
It makes you wonder if it's even worth importing some things anymore.
Yeah, the cost is just too high.
So were any countries spared from these new tariffs?
Actually, yes. Canada and Mexico got a pass on the 10% universal tariff.
Our neighbors to the north and south.
Right. But keep in mind, tariffs still apply if their goods don't meet the USMCA rules.
USMCA, that's the new trade deal between the US, Mexico, and Canada.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of fentanyl coming across the border.
So even though they dodged the big tariff, there are still some trade tensions.
Some specific issues that remain unresolved.
Now, let's talk about how China's hitting back.
Because they are not happy.
Their response has been strong. They said straight up they'll fight to the end.
Yeah, no backing down here.
And they promised countermeasures.
They're not just going to sit there and take it.
The Chinese Commerce Ministry didn't mince words.
No, they called the U.S. tariffs completely groundless.
And they called it unilateral bullying.
Strong words.
They're basically saying the U.S. is acting alone and pushing others around.
That's how they see it.
China says it's acting to protect its own interests.
They specifically mentioned sovereignty, security, development interests, and upholding the international trade order.
So they're saying they have a right to retaliate.
That's their argument. They see their actions as justified and legitimate.
And their retaliation isn't just talk either.
No, they've announced a bunch of tariffs of their own.
It's like a back and forth, a tit for tat.
You hit me, I hit you back.
So on February 10th, they hit U.S. coal and liquefied natural gas with a 15% tariff.
And they also put a 10% tariff on oil and agricultural machinery.
Then on March 10th, they expanded it to agricultural products.
U.S. chicken, wheat, corn, cotton, all hit with a 15% tariff.
And another 10% on stuff like soybeans, pork, beef, fruits, veggies, dairy.
Basically key American exports.
They're targeting things that matter to the U.S. economy.
And then things escalated on April 9th.
Yeah, that was a big day.
Originally, China planned to put a 34% tariff on all U.S. goods starting April 10th.
So a broad tariff like the U.S. did.
But after the U.S. raised its tariffs, China changed its plan.
They ups the ante.
Big time. They raised their tariff to 84% on all U.S. goods.
84%, that's a huge jump.
And they implemented it immediately on April 9th itself.
They basically mirrored the U.S. move, but even stronger.
An escalation for sure.
But tariffs aren't the only weapon in their arsenal.
No, they've got other tools as well.
They've been adding U.S. companies to their unreliable entity list.
That doesn't sound good.
It's not. PVH Corp and Illumina were added earlier.
Those are big companies.
And then they added another 16 U.S. entities.
So now 18 companies are on this blacklist.
Basically, it restricts their activities in China.
They might face limits on selling their products or even doing business there at all.
It's a way to punish those companies.
And they've also launched investigations into some U.S. companies.
Oh, yeah, like a multi-pronged approach.
An antitrust investigation into Google is one.
Google, that's a major player.
Then there's an anti-circumvention investigation into optical fiber products.
Anti-circumvent.
It means they're checking if companies are trying to get around the tariffs, like importing stuff through a third country to avoid the high costs.
Ah, so trying to find loopholes.
Exactly. And finally, an anti-dumping investigation on CT medical tubes from the U.S.
So they're using a mix of tariffs and investigations to pressure the U.S.
It's a full court press. And they're also looking at their control over key resources.
Right. They've slapped export controls on certain metals. Tungsten was mentioned initially.
That's a critical metal for a lot of industries.
But now it's expanded to 7 rare earth elements. Things like samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
They all require export licenses now.
And those elements are crucial for high-tech stuff.
Like smartphones, computers, all sorts of electronics.
So by controlling those exports, China can put pressure on industries globally.
It gives them leverage.
Definitely. And it doesn't stop there.
They also took aim at U.S. agricultural exporters.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
They suspended 6 U.S. companies from exporting certain agricultural products.
Like sorghum, poultry, bone meal.
They cited issues with food safety and import rules.
So they're hitting the U.S. where it hurts, on agricultural exports.
It's a comprehensive response.
Tariffs, investigations, export controls, restrictions on imports. They're using every tool in the box.
It shows how seriously they're taking this.
Definitely. And it's not just China reacting. We're seeing international responses too.
Yeah, like China, South Korea, and Japan are teaming up.
They agreed to strengthen free trade and work together on supply chains.
Specifically in response to the U.S. tariffs.
It seems like the U.S. actions are pushing these Asian economies closer together.
Maybe they feel like they need to band together against U.S. pressure.
It's definitely a sign that the U.S. actions are having ripple effects globally.
This is a big deal, way beyond just the U.S. and China.
It's reshaping global trade.
So what does this mean for the economies involved?
Well, let's start with the U.S.
Already, we're seeing shoppers at Asian markets in the U.S. bracing for price hikes.
Yeah, that's just the beginning.
Economists are predicting higher prices across the board.
Inflation is going to hit.
Everything from coffee and chocolate to iPhones and wine could get more expensive.
And the Cato Institute, they're really worried.
They're calling these tariffs a huge tax increase.
They say it'll lead to higher prices, slower growth, less investment, and fewer exports.
That's a lot of bad news.
They're even comparing it to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930.
That's the one that made the Great Depression worse.
Exactly.
The Tax Foundation did some modeling on this.
What do they find?
They say the average tariff rate on all U.S. imports will jump to 14.5%.
14.5%. That's the highest since 1938.
And they're projecting imports will plummet by over $990 billion in 2025.
That's a 30% drop.
A massive decline.
Huge impact on businesses that rely on imports.
But what about the government? Won't they rake in tons of money from these tariffs?
Well, they estimate the tariffs could bring in $2.2 trillion over the next decade.
That's a lot of money.
But there's a catch. The tariffs on China are expected to generate very little revenue.
Why is that?
Because the rates are so high, over 100%, it might make importing from China too expensive.
So instead of bringing in money, those tariffs might just block trade.
Exactly, acting as a barrier instead of a source of income.
So what about regular people? How will this hit our wallets?
The Tax Foundation says the average U.S. household could see after-tax income drop by 1.5%.
That's like a $1,500 hit in 2025.
And that might even be underestimating the impact.
Why?
Because as tariffs get higher, people will have fewer choices, and that could drive prices up even more.
Less competition means higher prices.
That's right.
And we can't forget about retaliation.
Yeah, other countries are hitting back.
As of April 4th, China, Canada, and the EU had retaliatory tariffs on $330 billion worth of U.S. exports.
So now American businesses are losing out on sales too.
The Tax Foundation thinks these retaliatory tariffs could shave another 0.1% off U.S. GDP.
It's a double whammy. Imports are more expensive and exports are down.
The Tax Foundation is calling this the biggest tax hike since 1982.
It's a major shift in economic policy,
And some sectors will be hit harder than others.
like the energy sector.
With those tariffs on Canadian energy, we could see gas prices spike.
Imagine paying 50 cents more per gallon at the pump.
That would hurt. Now, what about China? How are they handling this?
Well, their Premier Li King said they can handle it.
He said they're fully capable of hedging against adverse external influences.
So they're putting on a brave face,
Public investment firms in China have also pledged to stabilize the markets.
trying to prevent panic and keep things steady.
Interestingly, Chinese stocks actually went up after the tariffs were announced.
Maybe investors believe the government will step in and support the economy.
Analysts think China will focus on a few things.
Domestic stimulus, boosting demand within their own country.
Makes sense. If exports are down, they need to find other sources of growth.
They'll also try to strengthen trade ties with other countries.
Places not aligned with the U.S., maybe?
Yeah, particularly countries in what's called the Global South.
So they're looking for alternative markets.
And they might let the yuan weaken.
The yuan, that's their currency.
If it gets weaker, their exports become cheaper for other countries.
So it could offset the higher tariffs.
Exactly. But weakening the yuan also has risks.
Like what?
It can lead to inflation and make it harder for Chinese companies to pay back debts in foreign currencies.
So it's a balancing act.
Definitely. And it's worth noting that Fitch just downgraded China's credit rating.
That's not a good sign.
They cited worries about rising government debt.
So the things they might do to protect the economy could actually make their finances weaker.
It's a tough spot.
So let's step back and look at the bigger picture.
What are the broader implications of all this?
Well, the White House is framing this as taking back economic sovereignty.
They say it's essential for national security and economic security.
They're arguing that the U.S. has been losing out in trade for too long.
And these tariffs are their way of leveling the playing field.
But others are worried about a trade war.
They say these actions could disrupt the global economy.
It's a valid concern, right?
Absolutely. When the U.S. and China, two economic giants, start throwing tariffs around, everyone gets affected.
They're so intertwined.
In 2024, they traded $582 billion worth of goods.
And the U.S. had a huge trade deficit with China.
Somewhere between $263 and $295 billion.
So any disruption in that relationship is going to be felt globally.
It's like a shockwave.
China's saying these tariffs hurt their sovereignty, security, and development interests.
They see it as a direct attack.
So this isn't just about economics.
No, it's about power, influence, and national pride.
It's a high-stakes game.
Definitely. So what do we learn from this deep dive?
That this situation is complex, it's evolving quickly, and the consequences could be huge.
Both the U.S. and China are feeling the effects.
Prices are going up, businesses are being disrupted, and there's a lot of uncertainty.
The long-term effects are still unclear.
But one thing's for sure, this is reshaping global trade.
China's standing firm.
They're using every tool at their disposal to fight back,
They'll be looking inwards, boosting their domestic economy.
and they'll be looking for new partners.
Countries that aren't on the U.S. side.
For the U.S., the goals are to protect domestic industries and fix trade imbalances.
But there could be a big price to pay.
Slower growth, less income for households, higher prices for everyone.
It's a gamble.
This is a multi-layered situation.
We've only scratched the surface.
But hopefully, this deep dive has given you a better grasp of what's happening.
What stands out to you?
It's a fascinating but worrying time.
It raises big questions about the future of global trade and the relationship between these two superpowers.
It makes you wonder, where does it all go from here?
We'll have to wait and see.
But one thing's for certain, this isn't over yet.
Not by a long shot.
Keep an eye on this situation, folks.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Thanks for diving deep with us.
We'll see you next time.